This video is dedicated to Erica, and it comes with a warning. Drinking leads to neglect of duty, moral degradation, and crime. So don't do that. This is my first time tackling the Victorians, so a bit of context first. During Queen Victoria's reign, Britain's population grew really fast, and many people were pushed from rural areas into cities to work in factories. Cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham were incredibly overcrowded. The houses were built quickly and cheaply. Most working class families lived in 1 or 2 rooms. There was no bathrooms, no running water inside. Streets were often unpaved and full of rubbish, animal waste and sewage. There was shared outdoor toilets called privies, and disease spread quickly, especially cholera, tuberculosis and typhoid. In many working class districts, child death rates were very high. In some parts of London and Liverpool, more than 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Working class people worked long days for very low pay. A normal workday could be 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. Some worked 7. Men worked in construction, factories, shipyards, mines, or as labourers, while women worked in laundries, sewing shops, domestic service, or factories. Children worked too, a lot of the time in dangerous roles where smaller bodies were needed, such as chimney sweeps, down coal mines, or in cotton mills. Pay was low and unstable. If a worker got sick, they just didn't get paid. And unemployment meant eviction, hunger, death. There was no such thing as social benefits or pension. You just kept working till you fell down. Most working class people could not afford fresh food every day. So bread, tea and animal fat were very common. Potatoes and onions were staples, and meat was a rare treat for most people. Even then, it was usually cheap meat, which came from diseased animals or was stretched with filler. A lot of the time, the food was adulterated, meaning it had a lot of additives to stretch it further. Flour mixed with chalk, or milk mixed with water. Healthcare was incredibly expensive. Doctors charged a lot for visits, and so many people relied on home remedies and herbal cures. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Many women died giving birth or from infections after. A woman's legal identity was tied to her husband. If married, she could not own property, sign contracts, or keep her wages. Divorce was nearly impossible and highly stigmatized. Widows and single women were highly vulnerable to poverty. Respectable women were expected to stay at home, but poor women had to work. Domestic service was the largest employer of women. Most were maids, cooks, or nannies for the wealthy families. Many poor women also took in lodgers or did people's laundry and sewing. Life for women in Victorian Britain involved endless physical labour, cooking over coal fires, carrying water, hand-washing clothes. Mental illness was not well understood, and people showing symptoms were treated as weak, immoral, or possessed. Asylums existed, and they were often used to remove people who were seen as a burden. There was no help for depression or grief or anxiety, and working class people lived in constant anxiety about money and health and survival. Many people coped with alcohol. Gin shops were small local places where people could buy and drink gin. It was usually sold by the glass. These were not pubs or taverns. They were usually unlicensed and private. Often they were run by working class women straight out of their homes. They didn't have food or entertainment or even seats, just quick access to alcohol. Most had very few furnishings. Sometimes it was just a counter and bottles on a shelf. Some even sold spirits through windows, serving people directly onto the street. Gin was cheap, easy to produce and widely available. It could be flavoured with herbs, spices and sugar to mask poor quality. Beer was heavier and more expensive as it was taxed more. Gin was faster, it was stronger, and you didn't need to serve it in a glass or with a meal. Gin also didn't require refrigeration or special handling, so it was easier to store in small homes. Gin was predominantly drank by working class men and women, factory workers, seamstresses, dockers, navvies, anyone doing hard, exhaustive physical work. Women drank gin to relieve pain, to warm up, to ease hunger pangs, and to manage their grief or loneliness. Some even gave watered-down gin to babies. It helped them sleep. This is not out of cruelty but desperation and the lack of childcare and support. Gin helped these working class women dull the physical and emotional strain of things like childbirth and loss and poverty. People drank in small quantities regularly, especially in the evenings or after a long day. But gin shops were one of the few ways that working class women could make money independently. Running a gin shop didn't require a license or any formal training, and running it out your window allowed women to stay at home with their children. And that sliver of female economic independence was very troubling to middle-class men. They saw this as disorderly. Female-run gin shops gave poor women a degree of local authority. Sometimes this was respected and sometimes this was resented. And so gin acts in the 18th century tried to curb this mass consumption. But it didn't work and gin was still being widely consumed. Licensing laws were stricter, but small unlicensed shops remained common in working class areas. Police would often look the other way unless a complaint was made. By the 1860s, formal gin palaces have emerged. These were large gas-lit establishments selling gin. Most people weren't drinking to party, they were drinking to cope. Alcohol dulled pain, it made cold more bearable, and it broke the monotony of grinding work. Middle and upper class Victorians often judged working class drinkers as immoral and dangerous. They blamed the gin for poverty, social breakdown and child neglect, instead of recognising it for what it was, which is a symptom of these conditions. The term mother's ruin came from this idea that it was the gin that made women bad mothers, bad wives. But many of those critics drank themselves, just more expensive and behind closed doors. Gin was demonised not for what it was, but for who was drinking it. And by the mid-19th century, gin has become shorthand for working class disorder. Reformers and religious groups linked gin to crime, and they believed it caused infertility, madness, and moral decline. None of this was based on scientific evidence. A lot of it was driven by anxiety around class and gender roles and control. These poor women weren't just drinking, they were drinking visibly and without men, in public. Oh, God. This is famous propaganda. William Hogarth's engraving, titled Gin Lane, shows a drunk mother dropping her baby, surrounded by this chaos and poverty. Pamphlets and posters and editorials and newsletters warned you about gin and its dangers, and about how these women were immoral and dangerous, reinforcing traditional Victorian fears about women outside of male control. The temperance movement started to gain traction, and it encouraged total abstinence from alcohol. Reformers continued to promote the idea that alcohol was the cause of poverty, not the result of it, and the Salvation Army ran rescue homes for women it thought were fallen. While these efforts were framed as charitable, they often just resulted in shame and punishment for being poor, rather than providing any kind of support. Victorian society valued the ideal woman as sober, quiet, domestic, and obedient. A single lady, a working class woman, drinking gin on the street, not giving up. That was a threat to Victorian society, a threat to the British family values, to national stability. And so gin became a way to talk about fears of female independence, female sexuality, and working class autonomy. A man drinking port or wine was a ceremony, it was civilized. But a woman drinking gin, that was weak and foolish and dangerous. Meanwhile, rich women used laudanum, which is a tonic made from opiates, and this is considered medicinal and civilized and fine. Even today, mother's ruin is still used to refer to gin, even though most people don't know why. It's another example of how Victorian fear of the poor and moral panic about women's choices have shaped public attitudes for generations.